Liam woke not to the gentle rustling of oak leaves outside his bedroom window, but to a dead, sterile quiet. It was a profound and unnatural stillness, the kind that signals absence. For a year, since Sarah's passing, the sound of those twin oaks had been his metronome, the soft shushing of their branches a constant, living lullaby that kept the worst of the grief at bay. Now, there was nothing. He swung his legs out of bed, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. He didn't even bother with slippers, the chill of the hardwood floor, a distant sensation as he moved to the window. He pulled back the curtains and his breath hitched, a ragged, painful sound in the silent room. Where two magnificent 50-foot oaks had stood yesterday, there were now only two clean, pale circles of death. The stumps were brutally level, almost surgical, surrounded by a faint dusting of sawdust that hadn't yet been scattered by the morning breeze. The empty space they left behind was a wound in the sky, a gaping hole that let in a harsh, unwelcome glare of sunlight. A guttural sound tore from his throat, something between a sob and a roar. He stumbled back from the window, his hand flying to his chest as if he could physically hold his heart together. Sarah's trees, they had bought the saplings the day they closed on the house. Their hands covered in rich soil as they'd laughed and dug the holes together. "One for you, one for me," she had said, her eyes sparkling with the future. "They'll grow old with us, Liam." Now they were gone. He knew, with a certainty that was as cold and sharp as a shard of ice in his veins, who was responsible. He dressed in a haze, pulling on jeans and a faded t-shirt, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He didn't bother with shoes, the primal need for confrontation overriding everything else. He burst out of his front door and strode across his lawn, the dew-soaked grass cold against his bare feet. The property line between his lot and hers was an invisible but fiercely contested border. On his side, a lawn left to grow a little too long, wildflowers peeking through, the organic, beautiful chaos Sarah had loved. On her side, a pudding green perfect carpet of Kentucky bluegrass, chemically green and edged with militaristic precision. Brenda Millcroft was already in her front yard, of course. Dressed in crisp, white tennis apparel, she was meticulously snipping at a rose bush with a pair of silver shears, her movements betraying not a hint of remorse. She looked up as Liam approached, her lips thinning into a practiced, condescending smile. "Liam," she said, her voice as smooth and hard as river stone. "To what do I owe the pleasure this early?" "My trees, Brenda," he rasped, his voice raw. He pointed a trembling finger toward the stumps, the devastation. "You cut down my trees." Brenda set her shears down in a shrug with unnerving calm. "To be precise, Liam, the association's licensed and bonded landscaping contractor removed 2 trees that were in flagrant violation of the community bylaws. Section C, Paragraph 4, encroachment of branches over property lines, and Section F, Paragraph 2, excessive leaf debris. We sent you 3 certified letters." "I was busy," he choked out, the excuse sounding pathetic even to his own ears. The letters had arrived in the deep fog of his grief, unopened. Discarded along with sympathy, cards and bills, he couldn't bring himself to face. "Grief is not an exemption from the rules that hold our beautiful community together," she said, her tone shifting to that of a disappointed teacher. "Those oaks were a menace. The leaves clogged my pool filter constantly. The acorns were a slipping hazard for my grandchildren. They blocked the morning sun for my prize-winning hibiscus." She gestured vaguely at a row of perfectly manicured flowers. It was a simple matter of aesthetic uniformity and safety. Aesthetic uniformity. The phrase hit him like a physical blow. She had murdered a living monument to his dead wife for aesthetic uniformity. They were Sarah's trees, he whispered, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. "We planted them together." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Brenda's face. It wasn't sympathy, it was irritation. "Yes, we were all very sorry about Sarah, truly. But life goes on. The community goes on. And the rules," she added, picking up her shears again with an air of finality, "are the rules. Perhaps you should channel this energy into bringing the rest of your property up to code." She turned her back on him, the conversation clearly over in her mind. The snip-snip of her shears resumed, each metallic click a fresh stab in his heart. He stood there for a long moment, barefoot on the manicured edge of her lawn, the raw, brutal stumps of his past visible over her shoulder. The world seemed to tilt. The red haze of grief that had clouded his vision for a year began to recede, burned away by the white-hot fire of pure, undiluted rage. It was a different kind of anger than he had ever felt. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was cold, silent, and terrifyingly clear. Brenda thought the rules were her shield and her sword. She had used a contract, a bylaw, a certified letter to wage her war. She had followed a procedure to rip his heart out. He turned and walked back to his house, his steps no longer stumbling but measured and deliberate. The cold dread was gone, replaced by a chilling sense of purpose. He was a civil engineer, not the kind who designed skyscrapers, but a specialist. A man who understood the earth beneath the manicured lawns of Willow Creek Estates. His particular expertise was geohydrology and soil mechanics. He knew what this entire subdivision was built on. He knew its secrets. Inside his home office, a room he hadn't truly used in a year, he went to a tall metal filing cabinet. He pulled open a drawer labeled Willow Creek Dev GeoService 2005. He had been hired by the original developers as a consultant 15 years ago, a job he took before he and Sarah had even considered buying a lot here. He remembered the reports, the warnings he had given them about the substrate. He pulled out a thick file. Blowing a layer of dust from its cover, he unrolled a large topographical map and pinned it to his corkboard. It showed the entire development, every lot, every road. But it was the translucent overlay he placed on top that held the real story. It was a map of the karst topography of the region, the limestone bedrock, riddled with fissures, sinkholes, and underground voids, all carved by millennia of water flow. The developers had been required to perform ground-penetrating radar surveys. They had done the bare minimum, identifying and filling the most significant voids under the housing footprints, but they had cut corners on the open spaces, the backyards. They deemed it a manageable risk. Liam's finger traced the faint blue lines of the underground water channels. He knew this map like the back of his hand. He had warned them that certain areas were unstable, susceptible to subsidence if the local water table were ever drastically or suddenly altered. His eyes scanned the grid, past his own lot, 14, which he had personally certified as sitting on a solid shelf of granite. He moved one lot over, lot 12, Brenda Milcroft's property, and there it was, a notation he himself had made 15 years ago. A deep, significant anomaly, marked with a bright red circle, a Class 3 void. A cavern, approximately 50 feet down, 20 feet wide, and nearly 100 feet long. It ran almost perfectly beneath her backyard, and directly in the center of that red circle, shimmering on the satellite image he now pulled up on his monitor, was the sparkling azure rectangle of her in-ground swimming pool. Her pool, her pride and joy, the centerpiece of her perfect, sterile world. The very thing she had cited as a reason for destroying his trees. A 15,000-gallon concrete-lined, chlorinated symbol of her dominance, and it was sitting on a time bomb. A plan began to form in his mind, not born of emotion, but of cold, calculated engineering. It was a symphony of physics, hydrology, and geology. A plan that required precision, specialized equipment, and the cover of darkness. A plan that wouldn't just remove her pool, it would vanish it. It would use the very earth she sought to control, to swallow her arrogance whole. He spent the rest of the day in his garage, a space that had been silent for a year. He wasn't a man who owned chainsaws. His tools were more refined. He calibrated the portable sonic drill, its low hum, a comforting vibration in his hands. He checked the coils of the industrial-grade high-pressure water jet system. He mixed a solution in a large canister, not an explosive, nothing so crude but a proprietary non-corrosive polymer he had developed for a fracking project years ago. When introduced to porous limestone, under high pressure, it didn't dissolve the rock, but hyper-accelerated the natural erosion process, turning solid stone into a loose sandy slurry in a matter of minutes. He was methodical. He was focused. He was a professional preparing for a delicate, irreversible procedure. That night, under the sliver of a new moon, Liam dressed in black, he was a ghost in his own backyard, moving with a silence born of ebb. Brenda Milcroft woke at 5:30 a.m., as she did every day. Her internal clock was a marvel of discipline, calibrated to the relentless pursuit of suburban perfection. She slid into her custom Lululemon yoga set, the fabric a soothing compression. Against her skin, her morning ritual was inviolable, a lukewarm lemon water, 15 minutes of sun salutations on the patio overlooking her pool, followed by a review of the HOA violation logs. It was the bedrock of her orderly world. She pulled back the silk curtains of her patio door, expecting to see the first rays of dawn glinting off the placid, chemically perfected blue water of her oasis. Instead, she saw a chasm. Her mind refused to process it for a full 10 seconds. She simply stared, her brain cycling through impossible explanations. A trick of the light, a bizarre, vivid dream. But the scene remained, stark and horrifying in the growing light. Where her pristine, kidney-shaped pool and immaculate travertine decking had been, there was now a gaping, circular maw in the earth, a muddy, yawning pit of darkness. Shattered concrete and twisted rebar jutted from the edges like the teeth of a broken jaw. The air, usually sharp with the scent of chlorine, was thick with the smell of damp earth and subterranean rot. The lemon water glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the tile floor. A high, thin shriek tore from her throat, a sound of pure, uncomprehending terror that sliced through the morning quiet of Willow Creek. Estates. Liam heard the scream from his kitchen. He was sitting at the table, calmly sipping a cup of black coffee, watching the sun rise through the wounded gap in the trees. The sound was everything he had expected, shrill, panicked, the sound of a queen discovering her castle has crumbled into dust. A cold, grim satisfaction settled deep in his bones. He took another slow sip of coffee, allowing her terror to marinate for a full minute before he played his part. He walked out his front door, projecting an air of sleepy concern. Lights were flicking on in the houses around them. Mr. Henderson, from across the street, was already on his porch in a bathrobe, squinting. Brenda, Liam called out, his voice pitched to Carrie. Is everything all right? He rounded the newly installed privacy fence, another of Brenda's petty edicts that separated their backyards. He stopped dead at the edge of the devastation, widening his eyes and letting his mouth fall slightly agape. The performance was effortless. The sight truly was apocalyptic. The sinkhole was wider and deeper than he'd even calculated, a terrifying vortex of mud, splintered pool equipment, and murky water far below. Her prized hibiscus plants had been swallowed whole. A single pink inflatable flamingo lay half submerged in the muddy slurry at the bottom. A pathetic casualty. Brenda stood on the edge of her patio, her face ashen, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her eyes, wide with shock, darted from the chasm to Liam's face. The initial terror was already curdling, solidifying into a familiar, venomous rage. You, she hissed, her voice a raw whisper. She took a stumbling step toward him, a finger jabbing the air. You did this. Liam perfected a look of baffled concern. Brenda, what are you talking about? My God, your pool. Don't you play dumb with me, she shrieked, her voice cracking. Neighbors were starting to gather at a safe distance, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. My pool doesn't just vanish. This happened after you threatened me. After I took down your ugly, dying trees. I never threatened you, Brenda, Liam said, his voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to her escalating hysteria. He took a cautious step closer to the edge, peering into the hole with a practiced, professional eye. This is a subsidence event, a sinkhole. I warned the developers 15 years ago about the karst formations in this area. He looked back at her, his expression now one of pity. We're lucky the house is still standing. We're lucky you weren't out for a morning swim. The mention of geology, of facts and formations, only infuriated her more. It was a language she didn't speak. Her language was rules, violations, and power, lies. You did something. You and your engineering tricks? She screamed, her accusations growing wilder. You blew it up with what, Brenda? A stick of dynamite from the grocery store? He asked, his tone reasonable. There's no blast damage. The edges are a classic subsidence fracture. The police will tell you the same thing. As if on cue, the distant wail of sirens grew closer. Someone had called 911. Within minutes, the cul-de-sac was a flashing kaleidoscope of red and blue lights. 2 police cars and a fire engine arrived, their presence transforming the neighborhood spectacle into an official incident. Uniformed officers began taping off Brenda's entire backyard, their faces grim as they took in the scale of the collapse. Brenda, wild-eyed, tried to plead her case to a wary-looking police sergeant. It was him, Liam Connor. He threatened me. Yesterday, the sergeant glanced at Liam, who stood quietly by his own fence line, the very picture of a concerned law-abiding neighbor. Ma'am, what we have here looks like a major geological event. We're securing the area. The town engineer and a state geologist are on their way. I need you and everyone else to stay back. The dismissal was clear. She was being treated as a hysterical woman, a nuisance in the face of a natural disaster. Her power, wielded for so long through the HOA's bylaws and procedures, was utterly useless here. The earth did not care about Section F. Paragraph 2. Liam watched as the authorities took over. He answered their questions calmly and concisely. Yes, he was a civil engineer. Yes, he was familiar with the local geology. No, he hadn't heard or felt anything unusual during the night. But he was a heavy sleeper. He offered them his old survey maps, a gesture of helpfulness. It was the perfect cover, hiding in plain sight. Using his own expertise as both sword and shield. An hour later, a man in a hard hat and a vest labeled state geologist arrived. Dr. Eris Thorne was a sharp-eyed man in his late 40s, with a no-nonsense air that commanded respect. He conferred with the fire chief, then spent a long time at the edge of the sinkhole, studying the fracture patterns and the exposed earth. Liam stayed in his own yard, observing. Brenda had been led inside her house by a police officer, her furious, tear-streaked face occasionally visible in the window. The neighborhood was buzzing. People were scared. The very ground beneath their million-dollar homes was suddenly suspect. Talk of property values plummeting had already begun. Finally, Dr. Thorne walked over to the yellow tape separating him from Liam. You're Liam Connor? Thorne asked, his eyes scanning Liam's face with unnerving intensity. I am, Liam said. Terrible. Business, indeed. Sergeant mentioned you were the consulting engineer on this development. Your name is on all the preliminary surveys. Thorne pointed a thumb toward the chasm. I've seen a dozen karst collapses in my career. They're messy, unpredictable. This one is different. A cold knot tightened in Liam's stomach. Different how? It's clean, Thorne said, his gaze fixed on the sinkhole. Almost perfectly circular. The epicenter of the failure is centered on the pool's deep end drain, with a precision I'd call surgical. The surrounding soil displacement is minimal. A natural collapse usually tears the earth apart in a much wider, more chaotic cone of depression. He paused, turning his sharp eyes back to Liam. It's almost as if the destabilizing force was introduced at a single, precise point. Liam kept his expression neutral, a mask of professional curiosity, a pre-existing weakness perhaps. a lava tube or a deeper fissure that finally gave way. Perhaps, Thorne conceded, though his tone was skeptical. But the efficiency of it is remarkable. It would have happened incredibly fast. The structure of the pool contained the initial collapse, focusing the energy straight down. It's a textbook case of focused hydrogeological erosion, but the speed and precision are an anomaly. Liam felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back. This was not a weary police sergeant. This was a peer. A man who understood the science as well as he did. Thorne pulled out a tablet and tapped on the screen. Your original surveys were top-notch, by the way. You flagged this specific void under Lot 12, recommended against deep soil excavation for non-essential structures. Looks like the developer put in the pool anyway. He looked up from the tablet, his expression unreadable. It's good work. So good, in fact, I'd like to see the rest of it. The rest of it? Liam asked, his heart rate picking up. The raw data, Thorne clarified. The GPR pulse logs, the soil density metrics, the water pressure simulations you ran. Not just the summary reports. Everything. I want to build a model of the collapse, and your original data would be invaluable. It might help us determine if any other properties are at immediate risk. The request was perfectly reasonable, professionally sound, and utterly terrifying. His raw data would show the simulations, would show the exact pressure points, the fluid dynamics, the precise calculations needed to bring a specific section of rock to its failure point. In the hands of an expert like Thorne, the data wouldn't just describe a natural event. It could be reverse-engineered to look exactly like a blueprint for a targeted demolition. Of course, Liam heard himself say, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. I have it all archived. I'll be happy to transfer the files over to you. Excellent, Thorne said with a nod, seemingly satisfied. He handed Liam a business card. Send them over whenever you get a chance. The sooner we can allay the fears. The blinking cursor on Liam's monitor was a tiny, mocking heartbeat. Before him lay the digital soul of his revenge. Terabytes of raw geological data from the 2005 Willow Creek survey. It was all there, the GPR pulse logs, the seismic refraction data, the hydrological models, and buried deep within it, like a confession written in binary, were the precise simulations he had run on the cavern under Lot 12. The data that showed not just a possibility of collapse, but a clear, calculated pathway to it. Sending this to Eris Thorne would be like handing a detective the murder weapon, complete with fingerprints. Refusal was not an option. A consulting engineer jealously guarding 15-year-old data after a major geological event would be a red flag the size of Brenda's sinkhole. Therefore, the data could not be destroyed. It had to be corrupted, intelligently. For the next 8 hours, Liam didn't just delete files. He performed digital surgery. He delved into the raw code of the GPR logs, targeting the specific data points around the collapse epicenter. He didn't erase them. Instead, he wrote a complex algorithm to introduce cascading read-write errors, simulating the kind of data degradation that happens to old magnetic tapes. He then layered in random signal noise, subtly altering the density readings of the limestone shelf, making the cavern's roof appear thicker and more stable in some places, dangerously thin in others. He was transforming a precise blueprint into a chaotic, Jackson Pollock-esque splatter of possibilities. He was no longer just an engineer. He was a forger, an artist of plausible deniability. When he was done, the data still told the story of a catastrophic failure, but it now read like an unpredictable act of God, not a targeted strike. The surgical precision Thorne had noted would now appear as a 1 in a million statistical anomaly, a tragic, but natural, fluke. He compressed the doctored files, attached them to an email with a polite, professional note, and sent his perfectly crafted lie off to the state geologist. He clicked send and felt a profound, chilling sense of detachment. The man who had grieved for Sarah was gone, replaced by this cold, calculating strategist. While Liam was rewriting the past, the present was unraveling outside his door. The single strand of yellow tape around Brenda's backyard had multiplied. The city had condemned not only her property, but had cordoned off a 50-foot perimeter that ate into the yards of the 2 adjacent houses. Geological hazard area. No trespassing. Signs were hammered into manicured lawns. The serene quiet of Willow Creek Estates was shattered. It was replaced by the low hum of anxiety. Homeowners gathered on sidewalks, speaking in hushed, panicked tones. Their conversations were no longer about crabgrass and property lines, but about sinkhole insurance, foundation cracks, and Zillow estimates that were plummeting in real life. Brenda, once the feared enforcer of community standards, was now treated like a leper. Neighbors who once courted her favor now crossed the street to avoid her, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and accusation. She was the epicenter of their financial ruin. The power vacuum was immediate. With Brenda's authority in tatters, the HOA board was in chaos. The emergency board meeting, held on the Hendersons' front lawn, was a study in suburban panic. Brenda, looking haggard and smaller in a wrinkled tracksuit, tried to steer the conversation. We need to focus on the perpetrator, she insisted, her voice hoarse. This was a deliberate act of destruction by Liam Conyer. Brenda, for God's sake, Cut. And Marcus Vance, a corporate lawyer from 2 streets over with a slick smile and an ambitious glint in his eye. The state geologist has preliminarily classified it as a natural event. Waving your pitchfork at a grieving widower makes us all look unhinged. Our priority right now has to be liability and containment. Marcus had seen his opening. With Brenda weakened, the presidency of the HOA was up for grabs, and he intended to seize it. He projected calm competence and control everything Brenda had lost. Our insurance carrier is already trying to deny the claim. Citing the developer's original negligence, Marcus announced to the assembled board members, "This is a legal nightmare. We need a unified front. We need an expert." His eyes scanned the small crowd and landed, with theatrical weight, on Liam's house. Unaware of the political machinations, Liam was monitoring his own front. 2 days after he sent the files, he received a call from an unknown number. "Liam, Eris Thorne." The geologist's voice was flat, professional. "Got the data. Thank you, it's comprehensive. Happy to help," Liam said, his hand tightening on the phone. "I'm running the models now," Thorne continued. "You're right, the files are a bit of a mess. The signal degradation around Lot 12 is significant. Almost looks like the read head on your GPR was failing intermittently." "It was 15 years ago," Liam said smoothly. "The equipment wasn't what it is today. We did the best we could, of course," Thorne said. A beat of silence. "Just one thing I can't figure out. There's a hydraulic pressure log here. Shows a simulation for injecting hypersure fluid into porous limestone. Seems like an odd test to run for a suburban development survey." Liam's blood ran cold. He had missed that. A tiny simulation. A side project from another job he must have saved in the same root folder. "Ah," he said, thinking fast. "That was a side project for a mining company. Exploring loom-packed fracturing techniques. Must have gotten bundled with the Willow Creek archives by mistake. My apologies." "Right? A mining company," Thorne said slowly, the skepticism in his voice almost palpable. "Well, thanks for clarifying." The line went dead. Liam leaned against the wall, his forehead clammy. He had dodged the bullet, but he knew Thorne wasn't satisfied. The geologist was a dog with a bone. Meanwhile, Brenda was launching her own offensive. Stripped of her official power, she fell back on the other great American resource, money. She hired a private investigator. He wasn't a slick ex-cop from a downtown firm. He was a man named Frank Rourke, a rumpled, 60-something pie who specialized in sniffing out fraud for second-tier insurance companies. Frank looked like he'd be more at home at a racetrack than in an upscale subdivision. With his slightly too large beige suit and weary basset hound eyes that missed nothing, he met Brenda on her front porch, listening patiently to her frantic, rambling story about trees, bylaws, and engineering vengeance. He didn't interrupt. He just took notes in a small, spiral-bound pad. When she was done, he walked the perimeter of the yellow tape, his gaze slowly sweeping the entire scene, the chasm, the neighboring houses, and finally settling for a long moment on Liam's property. He looked at the 2 clean stumps, then back at the perfectly circular hole. He didn't say a word, but a thoughtful, analytical expression settled on his face. Liam watched the exchange from his kitchen window, a new sense of unease creeping in. This man was not a bureaucrat or a scientist. He was something different, something unpredictable. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to cast long shadows across the anxious neighborhood, Liam saw Marcus Vance striding purposefully up his driveway. Marcus had a politician's smile plastered on his face. "Liam, just the man I wanted to see," he said, extending a hand. Liam shook it reluctantly. "Marcus," Liam said, his tone neutral, "listen, the board is in agreement. The community is terrified. They see the yellow tape, they hear rumors, and they're panicking. What they need, is clarity. They need to hear from an expert, someone they trust." Liam already knew where this was going. "And you think that's me? Who else?" Marcus said with a sweep of his arm. "You're one of us. You're the engineer who knows the ground we're standing on. We're holding an emergency community town hall tomorrow night at the clubhouse. I want you to be the keynote speaker. Walk people through the geology. Explain what a sinkhole is. Tell them what the risks are. You can control the narrative, Liam. You can calm the storm." Marcus leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You can be the hero who saves this neighborhood's property values. You can be the man who restores order." Liam stared at Marcus. In the distance, he could see the private investigator, Frank Rourke, getting into a beat-up sedan. Before driving away, Rourke lifted a pair of binoculars and looked directly at Liam's house, at the garage where his tools lay hidden. The irony was staggering. He, the agent of chaos, was being asked to become the voice of reason. He, the man, with the darkest secret, was being pushed onto a public stage to explain his own crime. He was trapped. To refuse would make him look guilty. To accept would mean standing in a spotlight, directly in the sights of a skeptical geologist and a tenacious PI, and lying to the faces of all the people whose lives he had just thrown into turmoil. The silence of his home office was a pressure cooker. Liam stood before a full-length mirror, practicing his speech, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. On the projector screen behind him, A slide showed a cross-section of the local geology, his doctored, beautifully deceptive illustration of the cavern beneath Willow Creek. He wasn't just preparing a presentation. He was crafting the myth that would save him. The integrity of a karst formation is inherently unpredictable. He recited, his voice a flat monotone. He stopped, pinching the bridge of his nose. This wasn't him. The real Liam, Sarah's Liam, was a man who presented hard data with an almost religious reverence for truth. He was a terrible liar. Sarah had always teased him about it, how his left eye would twitch whenever he tried to fib about finishing the last of the ice cream. He glanced in the mirror, searching for the tell. His face was a stoic, unreadable mask. That man was buried, it seemed, under layers of grief and cold, hard rage. He rehearsed for hours, anticipating questions, preparing deflections, and memorizing the intricate details of his own fiction. He was no longer a grieving husband. He was an operative, and the community clubhouse was his war room. That evening, the Willow Creek clubhouse buzzed with the energy of a hornet's nest that had been kicked. Every seat was filled. The air was thick with fear, anger, and the cloying scent of cheap coffee. Marcus Vance, in a crisp suit, stood at the podium, basking in the spotlight. Friends, neighbors, Marcus began, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. In times of crisis, we have two choices: succumb to fear or seek out clarity. Tonight, we choose clarity. He gestured dramatically towards the side of the stage. And we are incredibly fortunate to have one of our own, a leading expert in the very science of the ground beneath our feet, to guide us. Please welcome Liam Connor. Polite, uncertain applause trickled through the room as Liam walked to the podium. His eyes scanned the crowd. He saw panicked faces, homeowners desperate for reassurance. He saw the other board members sitting behind Marcus, looking to him to save their collective financial skins, and then he saw them. His inquisitors, positioned like a tribunal. In the front row, Brenda sat rigid and pale, her eyes burning holes into him. Her usual pristine composure was gone, replaced by a raw, feral intensity. She was a woman with nothing left to lose. In a chair against the back wall, Dr. Eris Thorne leaned forward slightly, his arms crossed, his expression one of pure academic skepticism. He wasn't here as a neighbor. He was here to peer view, lie. And standing near the exit, almost swallowed by the shadows, was the pie, Frank Rourke. He wasn't looking at the stage. He was looking at the crowd, at Brenda, at Thorne, gauging the atmosphere, his weary eyes missing nothing. Liam began to speak. His voice, to his own surprise, was steady and authoritative. He clicked through his slides explaining the complex geology in layman's terms. He used analogies. The limestone was like Swiss cheese, the water like a slow, patient sculptor. He presented the collapse of Brenda's pool, not as a mystery, but as an inevitability, a tragic confluence of record rainfall, shifting water tables, and a pre-existing weakness that had finally, after decades, given way. He could feel the mood in the room shifting. The raw panic was softening, being replaced by a grudging acceptance. He was giving their fear a name, a scientific explanation. And in doing so, he was making it manageable. He was giving them what they craved, a story that made sense. And so, he concluded, pointing to a map showing the wider area. While the event at Lot 12 was dramatic, our preliminary models, based on the original survey data, suggest it was an isolated anomaly. The surrounding bedrock remains stable. Marcus beamed, stepping up for the Q&A. Thank you, Liam. A masterful explanation. Now I'm sure there are some questions. The first few were predictable. Is my house safe? Should we get our foundations checked? Liam answered them with calm, reassuring professionalism, building a wall of credibility brick by brick. Then, a hand went up at the back of the room. Eris Thorne. Mr. Connor, a fascinating presentation. Thorne began, his voice cutting cleanly through the room's chatter. You place a great deal of confidence in your models. But as you know, a model is only as good as its data. Given the significant signal corruption you yourself noted in the GPR logs directly around the collapse site, how can you state with such certainty that this was an isolated anomaly and not a precursor to wider regional instability? The room fell silent. It was a direct, surgical strike at the heart of Liam's forgery. Thorne was publicly calling his bluff. Liam met his gaze, his heart hammering against his ribs. An excellent and crucial question. Dr. Thorne, while the raw GPR signal showed some degradation likely due to subharmonic interference from a nearby utility line that was active during the original survey, we can cross-reference it with the seismic refraction and soil resistivity data. When you triangulate those three data sets, a much clearer, more stable picture emerges. The GPR data is an outlier in that context, not the definitive source. It was a masterful stroke of technobabble, plausible enough to satisfy the layman, and just complex enough to force Thorne to either accept it or engage in a deeply technical debate that would alienate everyone. Thorne's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew he'd been outmaneuvered in a public forum. He gave a tight conceding nod and sat back down. Liam allowed himself a flicker of triumph before it was extinguished. LIAR. The shriek came from the front row. Brenda shot to her feet, her face contorted with rage. He's lying to all of you. Marcus Vance moved to intercept her. Brenda, please, this is not the time. He's a murderer, she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Liam. He murdered my pool. He murdered Sarah's trees. Ask him about the tools. Ask him about the Hypersure water jet he bought 2 years ago. Ask him about the 50-gallon drum of polyonic accelerant he signed for at the chemical supply warehouse last Thursday. I have the receipts. The room erupted. The specificity of the accusation polyonic accelerant was chilling. It wasn't a vague claim, it sounded like a fact. Liam's blood turned to ice. How could she possibly know that? He had paid cash, used a false company name. His carefully constructed composure threatened to crack in the ensuing chaos. As Marcus in security tried to wrestle a hysterical Brenda out of the room, Liam locked eyes with Frank Roark. The pie hadn't moved. He wasn't watching the spectacle of Brenda's removal. He was staring directly at Liam, his expression unchanged. He lifted his phone, and though there was no flash, Liam knew with sickening certainty that Roark had just captured a photo of his face in the exact moment of raw, unmasked shock. The meeting fell apart after that. Liam stumbled off the stage, his mind racing. The receipts were a bluff, they had to be, but the terminology, where did she get it? He drove home in a daze, the adrenaline leaving him shaky and hollowed out. He had survived, barely. He walked into his silent house, the scene at the clubhouse replaying in his mind. Thorne's pointed question, Brenda's unnervingly specific accusations, Rourke's predatory stillness. He dropped his keys on the counter and booted up his laptop, needing a distraction. An email notification popped up. It had arrived 10 minutes ago. The sender was an anonymized, encrypted address. No-reply at proton.me. The subject line was a jolt of pure electricity. Willow Creek. Survey -2005. His hands trembled as he opened it. There was no greeting, no explanation, just an attachment. A single, small, data file. He knew its name instantly. sim_H2O_injection_lot12. It was the one file he was sure he had explained away. The simulation of a Hypersure fluid injection, but this wasn't the corrupted fragment from his archive. This was the original, the clean, damning, undoctored file. His file. Beneath the attachment, there was a single line of text. I know what you did. The anonymous email was a digital hand grenade that exploded in the silence of Liam's office. The single, undoctored file on his screen was not just data, it was a ghost. His ghost. And it was laughing at him. Paranoia, swift and suffocating, descended. Sleep became an impossibility, a luxury he could no longer afford. Every creak of the old house was an intruder. The rustle of leaves in the wind, a sound he once cherished, was now the whisper of surveillance. He spent the first night after the town hall in a frantic, silent frenzy. His engineer's mind repurposed for counterintelligence. He swept his own home for listening devices with a small RF detector he'd had for years, scanning the lamps, the smoke alarms, the television. He found nothing, but the absence of proof was not proof of absence. The next morning, before the sun rose, he was on his back in the driveway, the cold concrete seeping through his shirt as he ran his hands along the undercarriage of his car, searching for the magnetic lump of a GPS tracker. Finding none only fueled his anxiety. The threat wasn't physical, it was digital, which made it everywhere and nowhere at once. He locked himself in his office and began to hunt the ghost. Who had the data? Who could have accessed the raw archives of a defunct developer from 15 years ago? He drew a mind map on a whiteboard, the marker squeaking in the tense, quiet dot. Prescott Homes. The developer went bankrupt in 2009. Their assets, including digital archives, would have been liquidated or transferred. Finding who managed that process would be a nightmare of legal and financial. Archaeology.municipal archives. The town planning department would have his final signed-off report. But the raw data? The terabytes of messy, uncollated logs? Unlikely. Bureaucracies crave summaries, not sprawling datasets. A former colleague. This was the most chilling and plausible path. He had a small team at Prescott Homes, 3 junior engineers and 2 data technicians. They had all touched this data. He started with the most volatile variable. Brenda? Where had she gotten the term polyonic accelerant? It wasn't the precise chemical name he'd used, but it was alarmingly close. A garbled but recognizable echo of the truth. Had she somehow gotten lucky, or was someone feeding her information? He dismissed the thought. Whoever sent that email was too precise, too controlled, to be aligned with someone as chaotic as Brenda. Her outburst was a separate fire he had to extinguish. Meanwhile, his adversaries were not idle. In a sterile, white living room, that now felt like a prison, Brenda sat across from Frank Roark. The pie placed a small digital voice recorder on her marble coffee table. Your performance at the town hall was a tactical error, Mrs. Milcroft, Frank said, his voice a gravelly monotone, devoid of judgment. The receipts were a bluff, and it made you look desperate. In my business, desperation muddies the water. He's guilty, I know it, Brenda insisted, her voice brittle. Knowing isn't the same as proving, Frank countered. But you did give me something useful, not the receipts, the words. Hypersure water jet. Polyonic accelerant. Very specific, and when you said them, I saw something in Connor's eyes. A flicker, not of guilt, but of shock. The shock of being known. He leaned forward slightly. So, my question for you, Mrs. Milcroft, is where did you get those words? Brenda deflated, her righteous anger momentarily replaced by shame. I have a nephew. He watches a lot of those science shows on YouTube. I asked him how someone could make a hole in the ground fast. He just riffed a bunch of sci-fi sounding terms. I picked the ones that sounded smartest. Frank Rourke allowed himself a small, dry smile. It was a lucky, idiotic guess that had landed like a targeted strike. Okay, he said, making a note. So we have no leak. We just have a man who is very, very good at hiding things. Leave the technical side to the geologist. I'm going to look into the man himself. Purchasing histories are hard to trace with cash, but people have patterns, and everyone has a past. Dr. Eris Thorne, for his part, was pursuing a more direct approach. Frustrated by the corrupted data, he had successfully petitioned the town council, citing the ongoing safety concerns and the unreliable nature of the historical survey. He secured funding for an emergency, high-resolution ground-penetrating radar scan of the entire Willow Creek cul-de-sac. A notice went out to the residents. The survey would commence in 1 week. It would cover every backyard, including Liam's. It was a ticking clock. The new GPR was 1,000 times more sensitive than the equipment he'd used in 2005. It wouldn't just map the voids. It would map every disturbance in the soil. It would find the narrow, deep scar of his drill hole, as surely as an X-ray finds a broken bone dot. Liam saw the notice and felt a fresh wave of ice water in his veins. 1 week he abandoned all other lines of inquiry and focused on the team from Prescott Homes. He spent 2 days falling down a digital rabbit hole, sifting through the sediment of the past 15 years. One name kept rising to the surface, Anil Sharma. He remembered Anil vividly. He had been a junior data tech on the survey, fresh out of university. He was brilliant, quiet, and possessed a simmering resentment that Liam had never fully understood. Anil saw data not as a tool for understanding the physical world, but as a source of intrinsic power. Liam remembered an argument they'd had when Anil had found a way to bypass the security protocol on the Prescott servers. Liam had reprimanded him for it. We build things with this data, Liam had said. We don't play games with it. Anil had just looked at him with cold, unblinking eyes and said nothing. A quick search showed Anil had left Prescott Homes 6 months after the survey was completed. His LinkedIn profile was a patchwork of short-term contract jobs at various tech firms, culminating in his current role, senior threat analyst at a cybersecurity firm in the city. He specialized in data forensics and network vulnerability. It was him. It had to be. Anil had the skill, the access, and a 15-year-old grudge. He was the ghost. Liam knew he couldn't use any traceable method to make contact. He had to face him. He found a corporate address for Anil's firm in an anonymous office park, 40 minutes away. On Friday afternoon, with the GPR scan just 4 days away, he got in his car and drove. The office park was a soulless collection of reflective glass buildings. Liam parked across the street, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He was watching the main entrance of Anil's building when a familiar, sleek, black German sedan pulled up to the curb. The driver's door opened and Marcus Vance got out. Liam froze, his mind struggling to connect to completely separate parts of his life. Marcus, the ambitious HOA lawyer, the man who had pushed him into the spotlight, was here. He watched as Marcus, looking smug and satisfied, strode into the building. Liam waited, a sense of profound dread washing over him. This was not a coincidence. 10 minutes later, Marcus walked back out, got in his car, and drove away. A minute after that, a slender man, in a stylishly minimalist jacket, emerged from the building. He had the same sharp features and intense eyes. Liam remembered Anil Sharma. Anil stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looked in the direction of Marcus's departing car, and gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod of confirmation. The pieces slammed together in Liam's mind with sickening force. Anonymous email wasn't a threat from a lone wolf. It was the opening move in a coordinated attack. Anil had the weapon, the data, but Marcus was the one aiming it. Marcus hadn't asked him to speak at the town hall to be a hero. He had done it to establish Liam's credibility, to make him a public authority, an asset. He was building Liam up in the eyes of the community, making him indispensable. The blackmail wasn't about exposing him, it was about controlling him. They were going to make him their puppet. He would be the trusted local expert, calming the residents, endorsing whatever legal or financial strategy Marcus cooked up to seize control of the HOA and profit from the crisis. All while Anil held the kill switch on his life. Liam stared at the two men, now separated by distance but linked by a conspiracy that had wrapped itself around his neck. He had thought he was the predator, the avenger, delivering righteous, geological karma. He was wrong. He was just bait, and the trap had been sprung. The drive back from the office park was a journey through a fog of dread. Liam finally understood the full, terrifying geometry of the trap he was in. He wasn't just being blackmailed. He was being groomed. Marcus and Anil weren't going to expose him. They were going to own him. He would become their creature, the trusted local expert who would dance on their strings. His grief and rage weaponized for their profit and power. The GPR scan in 4 days was no longer his biggest problem. A lifetime as Marcus Vance's puppet. Wessie walked into his house, and for the first time since he'd vanished Brenda's pool, he felt the crushing weight of his actions. Not the guilt, but the consequences. He had built a prison of lies, and now others were seizing the keys. He looked at the photo of him and Sarah on the mantelpiece, her smile bright with a future that never came. What would she think of the man he'd become? Cold, vengeful, a man who had traded a living memorial for a chasm of dirt. He realized then he had only one path left. He couldn't outrun them. He couldn't outsmart them. He had to blow up the entire board. His frantic paranoia was replaced by a serene, terrifying clarity. He was an engineer. He had designed a collapse, and now he would design another, the collapse of the entire conspiracy, with himself at the epicenter. The next morning, the hunt began again, but this time, Liam was the one setting the traps. His targets were no longer ghosts. They had names and faces. First, he responded to the anonymous email from a public library computer. The message was brief. "You win. I'm done running. Let's discuss terms." He proposed a meeting. The community gazebo, 9 p.m., Tuesday night before the scheduled GPR scan. "Come alone. We finish this." He knew Marcus's ego and Anil's caution would ensure they both showed up. Next he called Dr. Eris Thorne. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice strained with calculated urgency. "It's Liam Khanna. I've been reviewing my archives. I've found something I overlooked. It's disturbing. It looks like evidence of deliberate industrial sabotage from the original development phase, focused on the bedrock. It could explain the collapse." He was baiting the hook with scientific curiosity. "I can't go to the authorities until I'm certain. I'm leaving a data drive with the relevant files for you. I need you to see it before your scan tomorrow. I'll leave it at the community gazebo tonight at 9 p.m., under the bench." Thorne, the consummate professional, couldn't ignore such a claim. He would be there. Finally, he targeted the wildcards. Brenda and her pie. He knew Frank Rourke was good, likely, monitoring his communications, so he made it easy for him. He used a cheap burner phone to call a disconnected number and left a rambling, panicked voicemail, knowing it would be intercepted. "The deal is done," he said, his voice thick with fake desperation. "The final payoff is tonight, 9 p.m., at the gazebo. I'm bringing the last of the evidence to be buried. Once the money is exchanged, it all disappears for good." He was painting a picture of a clumsy criminal trying to cover his tracks, a scene no competent Pye could resist. Tuesday night arrived with a heavy, humid stillness. The air in Willow Creek Estates was thick with unspoken tension. Liam walked to the gazebo, carrying a heavy black Pelican case. He placed it on the central bench, the stark, industrial object looking alien in the quaint suburban park. A few minutes before 9 o'clock, two figures emerged from the shadows. Marcus, looking triumphant in a tailored jacket, and Anil, silent and watchful. At his side, Liam, Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescending victory. "I knew you'd see reason. You're too smart to throw your life away." "What do you want?" Liam asked, his voice flat. "Cooperation," Marcus said smoothly. "The town is in a panic. They need an expert to guide them. You will recommend a series of expensive but necessary geological surveys and foundation reinforcements for the entire neighborhood, to be handled by a consulting firm of my choosing. You will also declare the land around Brenda's former property permanently unstable and worthless. The HOA will acquire it for pennies, and I will have a very grateful new business partner." He smiled. "You get to keep your freedom. I get to restore order. Everybody wins." "Not everybody," a new voice cut in. From the other side of the park, Dr. Thorne approached, his face a mask of grim intent. "Mr. Connor, I came for the data drive you mentioned." His eyes flicked to Marcus and Anil, then to the Pelican case. Before anyone could react, two more figures stepped out from behind a large oak tree. Frank Rourke, his weary eyes missing nothing, and Brenda, her face pale but resolute. "Looks like your payoff got a little crowded, Connor," Rourke said dryly, his gaze assessing the scene. Marcus's face paled, his smug confidence evaporating as he saw the converging players. "What is this? What's going on?" "It's a meeting," Liam said, his voice clear and steady in the sudden, tense silence. "I believe you've all met." He unsnapped the latches on the Pelican case and opened it. There was no money inside, no data drives, just the dull metallic sheen of the sonic drill, the coiled hoses of the water jet, and a canister with a handwritten label, "Polymer Accelerant." It was a confession, laid bare in steel and plastic. "You were all right," Liam said, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces. "And you were all wrong." He looked at Brenda. "I did it. I destroyed your pool. You took away the last living piece of my wife, so I took the heart of your perfect, sterile world. You wanted proof? Brenda, here it is." He turned to Thorne. "The collapse wasn't an anomaly. It was surgical. I've sent my full undoctored survey data to your office, and the DA it was delivered 5 minutes ago. You have everything. He faced Marcus and Anil. And you, he said, a cold fire in his eyes. You thought you could use my crime to create your own? You thought you could own me? He pointed a finger at Marcus. He was going to make me his puppet, to defraud this entire community. The DA has a recording of our last phone call. Marcus, it's all there. Finally, he looked at Frank Rourke. The game is over. There are no more moves to make. As if on cue, the distant sound of sirens began to cut through the night. The DA's office had been very efficient. The aftermath was a blur of flashing lights and official, urgent voices. Marcus Vance, sputtering denials, and Anil Sharma, silent and ashen-faced, were separated and questioned about conspiracy and extortion. Brenda stood alone, a strange, vacant look on her face. The victor in a war that had left her with nothing but a chasm next to her house and the ruins of her reputation. A police officer gently handcuffed Liam. The cold click of the steel around his wrists was a final, definitive sound. As he was led to the squad car, he felt a profound sense of release. The weight that had been crushing him for months was gone. Sitting in the back of the car, he looked out the window. He saw his house, dark and quiet. He saw the two pale stumps, like scars on the lawn. And then he saw something else. Near the stumps, almost invisible in the strobing red and blue lights, was a new, tiny sapling. A young oak, no more than 2 feet high, its thin trunk supported by a simple wooden stake. He didn't know who had planted it, a sympathetic neighbor. Perhaps a stranger who had heard the story of Sarah's trees. It was a small, defiant flicker of life in the midst of the wreckage he had created, a promise not of a happy ending, but of a possible new beginning. He had lost his wife, his home, his freedom. He had become a monster. But in this last, desperate act of self-immolation, he had taken back control. He had faced the consequences, and in doing so, had finally found a sliver of the peace that had been stolen from him on the day the chainsaws began to scream. The game was over, and he had lost. But in a way that only he and the ghost of Sarah would ever understand, he had also won.